Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you, Peter. I want to talk about whether I am still optimistic about China. Last year, I came to this podium and very boldly stated that East Asia is the future of humanity. That looks very flimsy today. I said that these East Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, are not only the most prosperous places on the planet, they are the least crime-prone places and have the most social cohesion in the world. And I live in East Asia. I love it there. And of course, there is a small exception there. It's China. However, I said that China is on the same growth trajectory that South Korea and Japan were on at one point of time. The question is, have I changed my views about China? Since the time of last PDAC, trade war between the US and China started, which seriously harmed the Chinese economy. China thought the US would give in, and Trump did not give in. Then Hong Kong protests started, and I have been to many of the Hong Kong protests over the last few months, and that seriously affected the economy of Hong Kong, with a possibility that it might have destabilized China, and it might still do in the future. And then over the last few days, a couple of weeks, coronavirus has hit China, which has put virtually the whole country in lockdown. People don't want to shake hands with Asians and Chinese anymore. I have been in the investment business for the last 16 years, and I have learned a few principles. I'm not sure if I would have learned those principles were I not in the investment business. And I want to mention two of those, and I want to intertwine those with what I want to talk about going forward. One is that I must change my mind when information changes. Do I still continue to be bullish on China? Now, we are biological creatures. It's very hard for us to change our minds once we have made them up. I want to be flexible enough to change my mind. I want to address another principle that I have learned over the last 16 years, and that is that perfection is a human construct. There's nothing perfect in life. When we get rid of something bad, we must be able to replace it with something good. Otherwise, we are taking a wrong decision. For example, several of my friends did not like Stephen Harper. And quite rightly, they voted against him, but they forgot what would come by voting against Stephen Harper. They got Justin Trudeau. So when you get rid of the bad, look for something better. Otherwise, avoid changing your position. Let me very quickly summarize what I spoke about last year at this podium. I talked about how rapidly Chinese economy has grown over the last 3 decades, something unprecedented in human history. It has continuously grown, and from nothing, from virtually no existence in the economic space, China has emerged as the dominant factor. Chinese consumption of commodity emerged from virtually nothing to consuming half of the world's commodities today. China is today neck and neck with the US in terms of the number of billionaires. China has more female billionaires than any other country on the planet. The list goes on and on about the progress of China. I also talked about the underlying cultural and social and political factors to do with China, which I said would be the reason why China would continue to grow, prosper, and evolve over the next few decades. But to put China in context of the world, I also talked about the first world, the Western society, and I talked about the increasing infantilization of adults in the Western society, and I mentioned that democracy creates tyranny of the masses, the tyranny of bread and circuses masses. Protesting in public is considered very erroneously in the West today to be a peaceful way to assert your political rights. In East Asia, ladies and gentlemen, anything like this would result into equivalent of pulling your pants down and giving you about 3 to 24 very painful lashes, and I completely approve of it. When you disturb public space, you create problems for those who have emergency needs, and you certainly destabilize lives of other people. Any public protest which disturbed the public order lead to destruction of civilization and destruction of institutions. East Asia does not do that. And I said that what we do in the West today, because of the anti-meritocratic democracy that the Western society has led to slimy psychopaths, jokers, as our leaders in the Western society, and things are not looking good. This will continue to degrade going forward. Last year, I also talked about the third world because I wanted to put China in context. These fine visuals are not very far from where I grew up in India. And I said last year that forget the third world countries, except of course for China, because these people are becoming increasingly savage and barbarian. And these people, savagery is actually correlated with increasing prosperity. In fact, its conventional wisdom is completely wrong about it. Increasing prosperity actually has been correlated with increasing savagery around the world. But basically, the reason I wanted to talk about the West and the rest is because we wanted to put China in context. Let's talk about China, what has happened in the last 1 year in China. This is Der Spiegel of Germany, says made in China to coronavirus. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's no evidence as yet that China designed coronavirus in the laboratory, and there's certainly no evidence that the Chinese people participated in creating of coronavirus, but it shows how unsympathetic the Western media is towards Chinese and China. In fact, had they written something similar about other communities, it would have been seen as bigoted and racist and narrow-minded. But somehow, blaming East Asia is acceptable. My guess is, ladies and gentlemen, that very likely the biggest sufferer of race violence in the US is East Asians. But let's carry on. This is one despicable man who I know many of you are fan of. This guy, Kyle Bass, has lost billions of dollars consistently over the last few years. And for the last few weeks, and why did he lose that money? Because he was short selling financial instruments related with China. In the meantime that he was complaining about China, China has grown probably 200% or more in terms of GDP. But this guy, for the last few weeks, have been wishing, hoping that China suffers more from coronavirus so that this guy can recoup his lost billions of dollars. Now, he might be telegenic, ladies and gentlemen, but I have grown to have increased contempt for this person. Look at this title, China is the real sick man of Asia. Imagine writing a similarly titled article saying Africa is the sick continent of the planet. It would be seen as bigoted and racist, but somehow the Western media thinks that it can get away with anything to do with East Asia. And there's a reason behind it, because East Asians don't protest in public, they don't disturb the public order, and they don't have the habit of whining, and they don't have a sense of entitlement that a lot of other communities have. Or quite rightly, and I agree, I don't disagree with what China did to the writers who wrote this article. They were thrown out of China. Thank you, China, for doing the right thing. Now, I quite like Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is a great mind, and I'm a big fan of Donald Trump. Steve Bannon, in an interview last year, said China is a paper tiger. Now, anyone who has spent any time in China, and I go to China probably 3 times a year, knows that China is not a paper tiger. In fact, everyone in this room should know that China is not a paper tiger, because not just the paper that you are writing on is likely made in China. Just about every material thing you see in this room has a very high probability of having been made in China. Certainly, the higher value-added technical equipment are very likely made in China. But again, I forgive him for saying that, because he has a strategic reason to call China a paper tiger. Now, as a result of this coronavirus, the first blame has gone to the top officials of Hubei province, where Wuhan is. They have been removed, and they will very likely face the firing squad. And do I have anything against it? I know you might cringe. I am fully in approval of this. I grew up, ladies and gentlemen, in Bhopal. I was in the university when Union Carbide gas accident took place, and within a few hours, the roads were ridden with thousands of dead bodies, and all the politicians, bureaucrats, army, police, and doctors that evening, that night, ran away from Bhopal. Bhopal was a lawless city for the next 6 months to 2 years. We had no emergency services because they ran away with emergency services. If I had a choice, even today, to put those people in front of the firing squad, would I do that? Of course I would. And I would do that because, ladies and gentlemen, I suffered. For the next 2 decades, if I heard a siren, my palms would involuntarily start sweating. They would be completely wet in a few seconds. What happens in the West, and that is what tells you about the degradation that is happening in the West. And again, I talked about the principle, which is that if I have to choose between 2 things, I choose the less worse thing. Instead of firing a squad, what does the West do today? A convicted terrorist gets an apology, freedom, and $10 million. If I had to make choose between firing a squad and this thing, I choose the firing a squad if I want to preserve civilization. There have been a lot of conspiracy theories about what's been happening in China. Fumigation of cities, the lockdown of the country, and indeed that is happening in China. But what else do you expect, ladies and gentlemen? This is an emergency situation. When you are running a quarantine operation, you have no other possibility to be heavy-handed and bring this situation under control. My question is, how many societies are capable of delivering on trying to control a spread of virus the way China is trying it? Look at Iran. And I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, that if coronavirus continues over the next 2 months, you will probably prefer to consider moving to China, because they can actually deliver on it, and it might kill hundreds of thousands of people in places like Iran. There is not just government participating in lockdown and quarantining measures. Communities across China, and keep hearing from my Chinese friends, they are self-quarantining themselves. They have locked themselves within their communities. They have built walls within their communities to isolate themselves. And this is a sign not just about protective measures for themselves, but it's a sign of social consciousness, because when you isolate yourself, you not only reduce the probability of getting the virus, you significantly reduce the probability of virus leaving your community. This is something Chinese should be congratulated for having achieved. But what does the Western media say? Mao-style social control. This is a social emergency, and this is what despicable title Western media thinks they can get away with. I don't know if a similar situation happened in Toronto, if we would be able to build a 1,000-people hospital. China built a 1,000-people hospital in 10 days. I'm not sure if we could transplant today's Americans to 1930s if they could build another Hoover Dam. I'm not sure if we could transplant them into 1950s and 60s if we could organize another manned moon mission. By far, the biggest projects in the world are organized, and organization is an extremely difficult job. It is what Chinese consistently deliver on, not just in China, but around the world. We should be respectful of the values that this country brings on board. Now, of course, a lot of mistakes have been made, and they will come to light. The doctor who first warned the government about it died. Some journalists seems to have disappeared, but again, I mentioned one of the principles in my earlier slides, and the thing is, we don't live in a perfect world. In any collective decision making, mistakes are made. But what better choices do you have? At least the higher level of Wuhan and Hubei province officials will face the firing squad, and that meets my approval. I was, late November last year, I was in a city called Changsha. It's about 1.5 hours southwest of Wuhan, the recently infamous city. Big chunks of Changsha look like any first world country. Now, of course, as you can see, there's a haze, there's pollution in China, but every time I go to China, pollution is less. I doubt if there are many or any city of China in the top most polluted cities in the world anymore. When I arrived in Changsha one evening, ladies and gentlemen, there was a building under construction. There was a lot of work happening. There was an absolute chaos, Chinese-style absolute chaos. There was no directions for people to move around that building. There were hundreds of workers. There were construction material all over. I had a long sleep, and when I came out later that morning, this was what that building looked like. A mall had been finished up, and it was operational. Dancing was happening, music performances were happening, and people were lining up to buy goodies. Which other society can deliver on projects that quickly, projects of that magnitude? China consistently delivers on it. I've been going to China for 10 years, and I consistently see that, and I find the Western media approach to understanding China, again, bigoted and despicable. This is a photograph of the display board of Changsha high-speed train station. It's an extremely clean train station, and I've been to many train stations in China. They all look like this, clean. This is a high-speed train leaving almost every 90 seconds from China. from Changsha, which China had no high-speed train network a few years back. Now they have by far the largest high-speed rail network in the world. Over the last few months, I've been to Hong Kong many times, and I was supposed to attend conferences and meet companies. But because I work for myself, I don't have to report to anyone. I decided to skip most of that work and ended up watching protesters. I perfected the art of figuring out where the next protest would take place. Over this time, I have grown hugely respectful of Chinese government, and yes, Chinese government, the Hong Kong police, and also of the protesters. China has been extremely calm about how they have dealt with Hong Kong. Police has been as humane as is humanly possible in dealing with protesters. Young girls, tourists, spectators have absolutely no problems watching these protests happening. Protesters and police, of course, fight it out, but you and I are perfectly safe in that environment. Something very amusing you see in Hong Kong if you keep your eyes open. On one side, as you can see, protesters, and these are my videos, protesters are blocking the road. And on the other side, counter-protesters are clearing up the road. This is something you constantly see. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to feel for the underlying culture of that society to understand that whatever happens, whatever the short-term bumps are, this society, not just Hong Kong and China, will emerge victorious. These protesters, these are young kids mostly, and I actually don't agree with what they are doing. They go to malls and they shout their slogans, they raise their hands, 5 demands. And they walk into alleys of jewelry shops, cosmetic shops, in electronic gadgets, and nothing ever gets stolen. That is the reason why Hong Kong does not have much police. In fact, East Asia does not have much police because the crime rate is so low. And that is why they can't bring it under control, because they don't have the policing system in that country. People police themselves in that society. On 22nd of December last year, I was at a protest organized by the same protesters in favor of people of Xinjiang, the Muslim province of China, because apparently China has a couple of people in labor camp kind of situation. Now, I have nothing much against China in terms of what they are doing in Xinjiang, but that's another topic. But you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Western flags being flown in this protest, and the government of China has accepted that situation. On the right-hand side here is the government building of Hong Kong. There's the 2 most important flags, Chinese flag and Hong Kong flag. And behind the building, behind the flag, is the PLA building, where hundreds of Chinese People's Liberation Army men are stationed. Look at the embarrassment China faced that day. Someone went up the flagpole, and I was sitting right below this flag, and pulled down the Chinese flag, and they desecrated it right in front of me. There was, of course, a huge fight between the police. A lot of police descended to the scene. There was a massive fight, but I thought that evening that China would enter Hong Kong and take it over. They actually just ignored that news. China has been extremely calm about what's been happening in Hong Kong. So let me conclude my talk here. I last year talked about East Asia. I said East Asia is the future of humanity. East Asia is suffering from some bumps right now. That can happen to anyone. Anyone who thinks that it is made in China and China must suffer is despicable and bigoted. The underlying factors still continue. My view is that China will not only emerge out of these problems, it will emerge victorious with better values and better focus for their future. East Asia, of course, most of the rest of East Asia is the most developed and safest part of the world, which is where I live. This place will continue. They are doing everything to maintain their civilization. East Asia will continue to be the future of humanity, despite that they are facing short-term problems. Unfortunately, for people living in the West, Trump is the only guy who is now stopping the destruction of the West. Once Trump is gone, either later this year or 5 years from now, US will start creaking because it will go extreme left very quickly. And all the virtue signalers who live in Canada and Europe, who think they are independent sovereign countries because of their own values and their own capabilities, will then soon realize that without the US to protect them, they can't really exist on their own. The West does not have much time left. That leaves me only with one part of the world, that is East Asia. Of course, I consistently remind people, don't waste your time on the third world. We are 4.5 billion out of 7 billion people live on the planet, because these people are becoming increasingly savage and increasingly barbarian, because the institutions that European colonizers left for them are getting increasingly degenerated and are getting decayed, and they are falling apart. And these people in the third world cannot rebuild those institutions. So yes, take an interest for academic purposes in the third world. I spend a lot of time in the third world, but don't invest your money and don't hinge the future of humanity on the third world. They are going nowhere. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.